Welcome once again, Professor, to this edition of SenseMaker. So today we're going to be talking about Stalin, and although we will be looking at this particular book, rather we'll be using this as a prism. This book is titled to be about Stalin, but it's way more than that. It's a way of looking into the world that got shaped and they in turn shaped Stalin, and then Stalin went on to shape the world as it is. This book stops in 1917. So this is not a complete biography of Stalin, but in more ways than one, it offers a picture of what made Stalin tick. So this is a book for everybody here, and also for people who are going to be watching it later. Is definitely investing in. As I was just making a joke with the professor that one of the advertisements for the book was that it could help you make muscle, but you should wait for the second version to come out, and perhaps then it'll be of more use. But getting into it, and there are many ways of approaching Stalin, and you've done a lot of these interviews. You've also talked a lot about it in academic things. So I will shake this up a little bit, and I'm going to jump somewhere in the middle of the book. When you talk about Stalin, so you start with where he was born, the iron constitution of his mother, and then him being a gifted student. But you use So-So, his name or his nickname that was used by his family. There's a very interesting chapter in the book from where So-So becomes Koba. Tell us about this transition of young So-So to Koba and what it reflects about the world that existed at that point of time.
First of all, thank you for having me. This is very fascinating to be able to talk about that big book, which took some 3 decades, off and on to write because archives were closed and then the Soviet Union collapsed, and we had to then wait until those archives were open. Well, this is really interesting, and thank you for that question. So-So to Koba. So So-So was his childhood name. This was a poor boy, largely raised by his mother. His father, a carpenter, was alcoholic and often away or distant. And So-So grew up in a way on the streets of Gori, the town in which he was born. I called the streets his first university. His mother, who was a very religious Orthodox Georgian Christian, in fact, insisted that he get an education. Her hope was that he would become a priest in the Georgian Orthodox Church. And so he did well in school. She somehow, through her incredible efforts, got him into the seminary in Tbilisi, in Tiflis, the capital of the Caucasus at the time, where he was to train to be a priest. I think I said somewhat jokingly in the book, at least I can say it here, that this Tiflis seminary probably produced more revolutionaries than it did priests, because it was run by nationalist Russian priests. The Georgian church was subordinated to the Russian Orthodox Church, and to assimilated Georgians who were very pro-Tsarist, pro-Russian. And it was repressive of Georgian culture and was very much condescending toward Georgians. And so out of that milieu of repression and limited access to certain kinds of readings, etc., Georgian students basically found their own way in secret bookstores, in what we would call samizdat, self-publishing, etc., to read the works of Russian literature, of Marxist literature, etc., and begin to move from orthodoxy and acceptance of the world as it is into becoming Marxist revolutionaries. And that Soso, that child on the streets of Gori in Tbilisi, in the Orthodox seminary, took on the name Koba, which was, of course, the name in a short novella of a Georgian outlaw, of a young person who was fighting the Russians and fighting the regime as it existed. And Stalin then modeled himself after that figure as he moved away from religion to Marxist revolution.
Thank you, Professor. That was very enlightening. When we talk about Stalin, the idea, and before I got onto, let's put it, somewhat of an intermediate learning program about Stalin, I would not say advanced, but it's slightly more informed than the basic program. I got to know that Stalin was an avid reader. And when he passed away, his library was still maintained. I don't know what's the status now. But he loved books. He loved collecting books. And he got a taste of it in the seminary. You mentioned some of the things that he read. In fact, there is a chapter where you detail out all of the things that he was reading and that he was even punished for. I think 3 or 4. In your book, there are 3 or 4 anecdotes about that. You made it very clear that you're not interested in a psychological analysis. There's not a psychological biography of Stalin. But what can we glean from the reading habits of this young, bright-eyed revolutionary in the making, who would go on to become one of the worst despots of the 20th century? What does his reading at that point of time tell us? And can we make a jump and say that, okay, this is a man who was predestined to become a dictator?
First of all, on the library was eventually given and is somewhat preserved in the Institute of Marxism-Leninism, or what was the Institute of Marxism-Leninism is now still exists in Moscow, so it can be used and seen. And there's a very interesting book by an Irish historian, Geoffrey Roberts, called Stalin's Library, so you can read precisely about that. And many scholars now, like David Brandenburger, have carefully examined Stalin's writings, notations, editing of major books when he was already the dictator of the Soviet Union, history of the Soviet Union, history of the Communist Party. So we know that this was not only, as you put it, an avid reader, but an avid editor as well. And he commented it in a way that we hope our students don't do in books that they borrow from our university library, in the columns and on the sides of the book. So we have kind of insight to his reading habits. And so it's important to consider what he was learning and how he was learning it. And in a way, given his formal education in religious schools, his own autodidactic, his own self-learning is extremely important. So the books he had access to and what they revealed. And we have some information about that from memoirs of fellow students and so forth. For instance, he read Darwin, and Darwin's idea of evolution was a revelation to him and undercut, as he understood it, many of the things he had been taught by the church. And he moved from religious understandings to what he would have considered scientific understandings. And eventually, when they found the literature, and it was difficult to find, they also read Karl Marx. They read small writings, translations, etc. And there was a critique of the way the world was that basically undermined the notion that capitalism was the end of history, and that capitalism was not just a stage in human history, but was the ultimate stage in which economy and nature became one. So that rather than historically created by human beings and various processes, capitalism was indeed the way economy must work. And these kinds of things undermine any conviction that the world was static and had to stay the way it was, czarist autocracy, repression of Georgians, etc. So I think those effects were very important. And what he substituted basically for his religious beliefs and his mother's faith was another faith in a worldview that was provided by what we call social democracy. That is the Marxist movement, which was then one of the most radical movements, sophisticated intellectual movements indeed, in the Russian Empire at the time.
In your book, and also sort of in an appraisal that you do for Stalin at that point of time, reading habits and then an extension of it. One of the things that caught my attention was that the intelligentsia, or Stalin's sort of love for being in the right company of intelligentsia, favored his acceptance or his move towards the Iskra compared to the others. One of the things I wanted to find out was, what were the alternatives? I mean, because Iskra at that point of time was still growing up. It was very, very much a theoretical extension of an idea. They were yet to figure out what had to be done out there, because Vladimir Lenin looks much older when we think about it in terms of the process of history. But if I remember correctly, he was only 8 years older than Stalin. So there was not that much of an age gap. He was much more privileged than Stalin, but he was just 8 years older and he was one of the leaders. So what were these ragtag group of guys going for at that point of time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It sort of makes me nostalgic for that period. Imagine, this is the 1890s, right? And Stalin is moving from teenagedom to young adulthood. And he begins to read in the 1890s and the turn of the century some of these Marxist writings, which are difficult to get, but which are very exciting for young people. And within Georgia itself, a group of intellectuals who were called the third generation, or the third group, Mesamadasi in Georgian, were already using a Marxist analysis to explain Georgia's history and Georgians' position in the empire and in the world. And people like Noya Jordania and others, those who would become ultimately opponents of Stalin, they would be in the more moderate Menshevik wing of the Social Democratic Party. They were already key intellectuals. And they had their own newspaper in Georgia, Kavali, which indeed was read, avidly read, enthusiastically read by these young students who eventually, many of them, would move over to a revolutionary posture and to Marxism. And in the analysis they were reading, there was something very hopeful and very useful for their own strategy. Because what Jordania was writing was that capitalism, still very, very embryonic and only nascent in the Russian Empire and in Georgia, was the wave of the future and would undermine the village and the peasants on whom an older generation of revolutionaries, the so-called populists or narodniki in Russian, were depending. And that one had to think and seek the fellowship and support of the number of workers who were there already visible in Tiflis, in Baku, in Batumi, oil workers, people on the railroad, etc. And this was really the future of a revolutionary nucleus that could overthrow Tsarism. Now, those were far-fetched and difficult ideas to imagine, and yet that very much was where Stalin started to go. You mentioned that Stalin by virtue of his education in the seminary, was already an intellectual. So here's a son of a cobbler, raised by his mother, educated in a religious school, and ultimately turning to revolution, and has this interesting self-identification as an intelligent, as a radical intellectual. This is very interesting because this group of radical intelligenti, these radical intellectuals, were separate from the class from which they had arisen. So he's both, in a sense, a member of the lower middle class, or he might self-describe himself as having somewhat of a proletarian background, which wouldn't quite be accurate. But he had risen to become a worker intellectual. That would be something that Lenin particularly would value, that, oh, we have people from the bottom of society who themselves have risen up, educated themselves, adopted a Marxist outlook, and can help us make this revolution, right? So Stalin was very valuable to people like Lenin and to others who were looking for such people. And in this way, he created this new identity for himself, this new role. And this was where Koba emerges in underground. Now imagine Stalin moving out of the seminary into his first job, and probably the only job that ever gave him a steady salary, working at an observatory in Tbilisi. Stalin was creating a new identity for himself, one that already placed him outside the normal society of the Tsarist Empire. He had, in a sense, adopted an outlaw position. He was outside the law, and he would be followed and persecuted and pursued, precisely living outside what might have been another career, a much more easy career for him. And yet that was the choice he took, and the future, of course, could not be anticipated.
It is a fascinating thing. I mean, of course, even before reading this book, I knew that the only job on record that Stalin held was as an amateur meteorologist.
Right.
But that was, I mean, he was not really doing the job. Even there, it was a bit of his own old boys network. A lot of the seminarians were there, and they were trying to support each other. But he also had another job. I mean, it was not really a job. He had gone there to agitate. In 1902, the Rothschild oil works, if I'm not wrong. Except there was a raid and they were arrested, and it never came to be. There are two questions here. One, how does a person who is just taking temperature recordings rise up to become the greatest dictator of 20th century? Or rather, let me rephrase it, because that would be unkind on him at that point of time, the ruler of the world's largest organization. At a point of time, I mean, it had the entirety of USSR. And he was not just a ruler, he also played a significant role in getting it together. But more importantly, and a question that I have been trying to find an answer for in all of the biographies that I read for Stalin, how was he funding his lifestyle? His mother, you made terrific notes about the fact that he was somebody who was well fed. He was always well dressed. The transition to being a revolutionary, there are no records that his clothes suffered the same that other people did. How was he getting by?
There were a couple of ways. He did receive funding here and there and very intermittently from the party itself once he became an agent of that party. And there's not a lot of knowledge about that. And also, you know, once he became a member of the party, and participated in things. He did. He worked in a factory for some time in Batumi, and later he was a leader of a group that actually led, you might even call it a terrorist group in 1905 that raided different organizations. And so there would be some income from that. It was always hand to mouth. This is not a way of self-enrichment in any way. The task was the revolution. The task was the movement itself, and one sacrificed for that. It's true that Stalin managed at times to look rather dapper. He would wear a scarf and so forth, and maybe. But there's also recordings and memoirs that he also was quite shabby at times as well. After all, he was on the run. He went to Batumi. He organized and led a strike there, which turned out to be a disaster. People were killed. He was arrested for the first time. He was exiled to Siberia. He escaped from there. And from then on, he was arrested and escaping and on the run for much of the rest of his career until late in the Tsarist period, just before World War I. He's arrested and sent to Siberia and stays there for the last 3 or 4 years until the revolution liberates him. So it's a career of a person so dedicated to a revolution, so dedicated and confident that this is going to work out somehow. And that confidence is given to him by the way he read Marx and understood the flow of history, which of course doesn't ever operate the way you think or the way Marxists or liberals or anyone else thinks it might work. There's a lot of contingencies, accidents, and unexpected events in history. But in Russia, somehow, it did work out that way. It worked out that the country went to war, a war it couldn't sustain, and ultimately, lower class people, women, workers, soldiers in the capital overthrew the Tsar. And the next thing you know, a small outlawed party, the Bolsheviks, finds itself in Petrograd, in the capital, and within 7-8 months, it comes to power. These are events that are unthinkable and unpredictable in advance. So that's the nature of history and revolution. You never know what twists and turns will occur. Who would ever have thought that a billionaire celebrity would become president of the most powerful country in the world?
That is true. That is true. Before we jump into the interesting 1905, the Menshevik split, especially between the Russians and the other outlying satellites, I wanted you to comment on the sort of the inner mental life of Stalin at this point of time. He can speak perhaps more than 3 languages, but he can speak fluently Russian and his own mother tongue, which is very, very different from Russian. And yet, the sense of independence or the sense of autonomy that he wanted to exercise while he was in the seminary, at this stage, has largely receded into the background, and he's looking for a revolution. Do we have any records, any information about this period of time in his life, and how would this later impact him, especially when it comes to the question of identity, what he goes on to do in Ukraine, for example?
There are very interesting things about this early period that have to be mentioned. So the dominant intellectual movement around the time that Stalin leaves the seminary and is entering the revolutionary movement is this group of Marxist intellectuals who eventually will be the leaders, effectively, of what you could call the Georgian National Liberation Movement. And those Georgian intellectuals, led by Noya Jordania, who will be a serious opponent of Stalin's, that movement the leaders eventually of the independent republic from 1918 to 1921 and then exiled to Paris, that movement is one that Stalin does not feel comfortable within. So Stalin joins the Bolshevik wing of the Social Democratic Party, which is a minority in Georgia, and ultimately, by 1905, has to leave Georgia. He'll leave a little bit later, move to Baku and try to make his career in the city where there's serious proletarian presence and oil production, and then go on to Central Russia, etc. So, but Georgia will be in some ways alien to him because it will be dominated by his Marxist opponents, the Mensheviks, after 1905. That's a very important development that takes place. And I think there's several psychological elements that you might emphasize here. First of all, as you mentioned, this is not a psychoanalytical biography. I have no dominant psychological theory, Freudian psychoanalysis or Jungian philosophy or anything like that, or as Robert C. Tucker had, Karen Horneyan ideas of how heroes are produced, etc. Those I don't play with. Now, you can't do a biography without investigating some psychology. That is, how is he developing? As far as we can tell from letters or comrades' remarks or his actions, what do you think he's thinking? Now, that's not easy with Stalin. The records are not there. He didn't write a diary or keep an archive of personal letters or anything of the kind. So we do this from fragments. And you see, in fact, a person who develops over time. And you can, in fact, see a kind of arc developing. And the arc, which I think I emphasize, is a move away from empathy to a kind of more Machiavellian and instrumentalist view of what is necessary to make the revolution succeed. So Stalin begins, and I think it's important to mention this, as a kind of romantic Georgian nationalist youth. He's a rather good poet. He sings. Can you imagine? Stalin sings and has a beautiful voice and is known as Bulbuli, the nightingale, in school. And this nightingale, this romantic poet, will evolve as he moves through the revolutionary movement as an outlaw and watching comrades arrested and tortured and himself suffering exile into a much hardened figure, one more suspicious and worrying about betrayal. So he has a close group of friends and comrades on which he depends to some degree and which he makes dependent on him. But at the same time, he understands that the opposite of friendship is betrayal and that one has to be suspicious. All of those complex things you can see in Stalin. You can also see in some of his letters and some of the things people write about him that he's a person of ambition, of confidence, of courage. After all, he's chosen this outlaw life, that he's becoming, in fact, harder. He actually is very interested in the unity of the party and fearful of its disintegration. That's something that he will carry on into the future and will use and will be part of the motivation for actually killing comrades later in order to, in his own bizarre and paranoid fantasy, unification of the party in the 1930s. So you can see traces of that, right, without necessarily projecting everything into the future. But the major arc is, in my view, a hardening of character, a erosion of empathy. I'm very interested in emotions in history. We leave out emotions because they're hard to use, right? Political scientists are perfectly happy to use rational choice theory. We all work to maximize our utilities, what's good for us, what's in our interest. Great theory, very powerful, but it's a rather desiccated theory of human nature, and it leaves out the affective, the emotional side. And so I tried to think about what is the dominant emotion here, and it seems to be an erosion of empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is the feeling for other people, the ability to think about what affects other people. And when you have that emotion, society becomes possible. But Stalin, I think, is a person in which that very important social emotion ultimately is radically suppressed in his dominant ambition to be part of a movement that can actually overthrow a government of 300 years and create a new society, ruthlessly as it might have been, but ultimately rather effectively turning, as we know, a largely agrarian society into the second greatest industrial power in the world by the end of his life.
So one of the interesting things about this book has been that you dismantle long-held beliefs about how these movements operated. These were not cohesive, homogeneous entities, as we've been led to believe. The period that I'm interested in is the October 1905 revolution. That was the, as you call it, the apogee of the revolution had been reached at that point of time. So the revolution happens in October 1905. Then there is a break between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks as to what has to be done. 1906 and 1907, there is a failure, and this revolution kind of crumbles down. What was going on during this time? And the sense that I draw from the book was that this was a critical time in turning Stalin from a young revolutionary on the fringes, central as he might have been in that part of the sort of the provincial revolution, to bringing him closer to the action. So A, what role did he play in this? And B, what role did this time play in turning Stalin into a leader in making?
I think you are giving me permission to talk about my favorite topic. So I'm going to take the opportunity and do that. So this book, in a way, was an effort and using the figure of Stalin somewhat opportunistically, but, centering on his growth, because I thought people would be interested in that, to investigate deeply the pre-revolutionary history of Russian Marxism in all of its complexities. Now, there may be more of that in this book than anyone but a few of us is interested in. But I have lived with that a long time and been fascinated by it. So that's what I was very interested. And some people have rightly criticized the book as sometimes losing the thread of Stalin biography and spending a lot of time in the intricacies of Marxism. But as someone who takes Marxism very, very seriously and hates to see how Marxism is dismissed, in my country at least, or distorted, or used by the right wing and by the conservatives and the Republicans as a battering ram, as something to be attacked systematically and always lied about, I took this opportunity to recreate and restore an understanding of those Marxist developments. And so this is in some ways a revisionist account from some of the classics of Cold War scholarship that talked about the social democratic movement in order to find the roots of what the Soviet Union became. And there are a couple of important things that I think I found that I wish to emphasize. The first was that Russian social democracy, which was a Marxist movement that took Marx's writings and Engels' writings and Plekhanov's writings seriously as a sociology to understand the nature of the world they lived in and what might occur, that movement was largely about, and this is a strange thing to emphasize, but when you read it in depth, you see it over and over again, it was about democracy. It was a Russian social democratic movement was a democratic movement about empowering the working class and about creating a democratic system, because remember, there are two revolutions in Marxism. There's a bourgeois democratic revolution against feudalism and autocracy and the ancien regime that creates the conditions to create a capitalist bourgeois democratic society in which the working class can develop and flourish. And only later, with the full development of capitalism, would you have a socialist proletarian revolution. And Russia was, in the understanding of every Russian Marxist, at a low stage of development, and what was on the agenda was a democratic revolution, a revolution to overthrow Tsarism and create the conditions for the explosive development of capitalism and democracy, in which workers could then develop, become sophisticated, and eventually organized enough to overthrow the bourgeoisie and create a socialist society long in the future, right? Now that changed both in the period you mentioned, late of 1905, when so enthusiastic were certain revolutionaries like Lenin, Trotsky, even the leader of the Mensheviks, Yuli Martov, that they thought they could speed up this thing and move toward socialism, with help from the West, etc. Right? That they had to give up for a while, and that revives in the Lenin-Trotsky view in the 1917 again, that the revolution in Russia can be so unique that we can move beyond the bourgeois democratic stage, seize power in the name of the Soviets, and then stimulate revolution in the West, which will come and help us create the possibilities of socialism. Well, that gamble didn't work out. Lenin's gamble, that is, the revolutions in the West were all crushed, and the Soviet Union was left on its own and developed in its own way. And there's debates about what that did to Marxism internationally, etc., as young revolutionaries everywhere in the world were trying to figure out, what do we do now? And we have one socialist, so-called socialist state in the Soviet Union. Do we follow it? Do we learn from it? And history developed in its own unique way that, again, was largely unpredictable. So that was very important, that this revolution was all the way up to, you could say, April 1917, about democracy. The second thing I was most interested, sorry for the long-winded answer, was the division between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, which I thought was misunderstood. Now, during the Cold War, of course, Lenin, particularly in the United States and in Britain, was anathema. Lenin was the founder of the major enemy state of Western bourgeois democracy and capitalism. And so Lenin had to be demonized, and it was Lenin who destroyed the unity of the Social Democratic Party. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't. Lenin won the majority of the Second Congress in 1903, and it was Mensheviks who actually led the revolt against the majority, and eventually the party split between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. And there were serious ideological differences between these two wings. Lenin and the Bolshevik, or what was called the majority wing, though it wasn't always the majority, were always more militant, more willing to go further, less willing to align with and ally with the middle class, with the liberals, with the bourgeoisie. And the Mensheviks were more moderate, didn't want to frighten the bourgeoisie, the liberals, and wanted to work with them, if possible, toward the revolution. And this was very important in 1917, when the revolution broke out and the Mensheviks basically took a moderate position and tried to work with the existing provisional government with liberals and conservatives, etc. And through 1917, the situation in Russia became increasingly radical, and Bolsheviks became stronger and stronger. And Lenin took the position, we shouldn't work with the upper and middle classes. We should have a revolution based solely on the lower classes, on these councils called Soviets, made up of workers, some peasants, and soldiers. And ultimately, that tactic, because of the polarization in Russian society, particularly in the cities, was the one that was most successful. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks came to power in October. So that's an extraordinarily important thing. And I was overly interested. And sometimes I will confess the book becomes tedious. And I ask people to skim if they're not really interested in all the details of Marxist discussions, some parts, particularly after 1905, say 1907, 9, 10, in the discussions that go on in the party. I'm fascinated by them and by Lenin's maneuvers, etc. Stalin at that point is somewhat annoyed by Lenin's insistence on some of these philosophical issues, etc. And they show there a difference between the two wings. But I thought they should be illuminated, that this book should be a record of those debates and how they could be understood. And apparently enough Marxists in England thought that was valuable that they gave the book a prize, the Deutsche Prize, which is the prize for the book that most advances Marxist understandings. And I was thrilled to receive that prize because, as one comrade of mine said, Ron, that's the only book prize worth winning. Doesn't gain me a lot of friends at the Hoover Institution.
Right. So I'm going to give you another, what I presume is something that you like, because it comes up twice or thrice. What was the disagreement between Stalin and Lenin about the peasants, especially keeping in mind what Stalin was advocating after 1905, and I think it continues till late 1909, was the exact opposite of what he went on to do in 1928. Started at that point of time, collectivization. So, what was the disagreement, and then what changed?
This really is what is called in America often inside baseball, or getting into the weeds of a discussion. So, of course, the peasant question was a central question in Russia, right? 80 to 85% of the Russian population at the time of the revolution was peasants living in villages. And this is one of the great achievements of the Soviet Union. It turned a country, the largest country in the world, from 80% peasants in 1917 to 80% urban city dwellers by the end of the Soviet Union, right? Through the industrialization program. So what to do with the peasants, especially by a small party of Marxists who were supposedly centered on the working class, was key. And there were disputes. I mean, in the congresses that these social democratic had before the revolution, they would debate the future of the country, of what they thought after the revolution they would be ruling. This shows the enormous confidence that these isolated revolutionaries, who can't even hold their congresses, of course, in Russia, they're held in London and Stockholm and Copenhagen and wherever, Brussels, they can land, right, before the revolution. And they debate this peasant question about what to do with the peasants. And they disagree about what to do with the peasants. And there are various policies. And Stalin, unlike Lenin, in the period after 1905, takes a relatively radical position that if you want to win over the peasants, then you better consider giving them the land. And the Mensheviks and Lenin, they differ one with another, but I won't go into all the detail, have a much more moderate position. Really? Give all the land to the peasants? The peasants are a petty bourgeois class. This might stop further development of agriculture and the movement towards socialism. So maybe tactically, we ought to have different solutions rather than turning the vastest resource of Russian economy into the hands of these villagers, etc. And in a funny way, Stalin is more correct here than Lenin. And in 1917, 1918, the Bolshevik Party will essentially adopt a position, all land to the peasants, right? All land to the peasants. They'll give the land away, and they'll gain, if not the active support of the peasantry, they'll gain the acquiescence of the peasantry, and millions of peasants will join the Red Army and fight for the Bolsheviks against any restoration of the old regime in the villages, which would have, of course, benefited Russian landowners. That's an alliance, a very important alliance, that helps the Bolsheviks come to power. Peasants don't love the Bolsheviks. They in fact are critical of them during the Civil War because the Bolsheviks are taking grain from the villages to feed the army in the city and to survive. But ultimately, there's a compromise. And then Lenin, very importantly, strategically in 1921, adopts something called the New Economic Policy, which essentially allows the peasants to stay on the land and control the agricultural economy for the next 7 or 8 years until Stalin adopts the rather radical position of collectivizing agriculture and dominating the peasantry in order to industrialize the country. So, you know, Marxists are not fixed in a single view, but one should remember Engels' famous view that it would be a terrible thing for a regime, a Marxist regime, in fact, to create a situation of war against the peasants and try to move beyond what they might want at a certain moment. And there are consequences of that turn toward collectivization and the cities taking, in a sense, and the party taking over the villages. And ultimately, that's what forges, as Moshe Levin, the great Russian historian Moshe Levin, argues, that was the foundation of what would become the Stalinist despotism, the tyranny of the party over the population.
So we are edging towards the 1 hour mark, and I'll have to open it up to people who are listening in. So that gets me to 2 last questions, and then I open it to everybody. You just mentioned that these people who were kind of roaming around, for lack of a better word, but thinking about what they're going to do when they come to rule Russia. So they were holding their conferences in Stockholm, London, so on and so forth. These cosmopolitan exposure seems to not have had any impact on how they perceived this from an international lens. But there is a very interesting anecdote in the book where Stalin goes to meet Lenin in Krakow, and he's hungry because he insisted on speaking in Russian in Poland, and nobody gave him food because. So, how did this sort of an international movement do political correctness? Was it something that was in the frame, or was it just there was so much revolutionary activity happening that you could offend and survive the underground? Because would you not need empathy and support from that underground to exist in their cities?
If I understand what you're getting at, so remember that Stalin is not Russian, Stalin is a Georgian, and Lenin appreciates this fact that this young man, a proletarian intellectual from the borderlands, is supposed to be somewhat sophisticated about what will be known as the nationality question that will arise around 1912, 1913 as a major issue in the empire among intellectuals, etc. So this is very important. And if that anecdote is correct, and I guess I'm saying that it's plausible or at least suggestive, if I used it in the book, then Stalin seemed insensitive to the feelings of Poles on the borderland at the moment that he crosses from Russia proper into Poland and then goes to see Lenin in Krakow, which is largely Polish, but in the Austrian Empire. Lenin will at that point use Stalin as one of his few experts on the national question. He will also use an Armenian Bolshevik, someone I'm very fond of, who will ultimately be martyred in 1918, executed by anti-revolutionaries, anti-Bolsheviks in Central Asia, Stepan Shahumyan. The loss of Stepan Shahumyan, a very sophisticated cosmopolitan, much more humane figure than Stalin, will, of course, accelerate Stalin's career, because the absence of someone called the Caucasian Lenin, because he's killed in September 1918, means that Stalin will become a prominent person close to Lenin and a acknowledged expert on the national question. He'll become the People's Commissariat of Nationalities. And if I may use this opportunity, this is an important moment in Stalin's intellectual and political development, because Lenin decides that Stalin ought to write a pamphlet, a booklet on the national question, on Marxism and the national and colonial question, which he does, and which Lenin approves of. And that book, written by an obscure Caucasian Marxist, is published in an obscure journal that's read by a few people. But later, of course, when Stalin becomes central to the Soviet experiment, it becomes the blueprint for the solving of this problem of nationality. So the Soviet Union, like Tsarist Russia, largest country in the world, is actually a multinational state, not unlike India, with all kinds of nationalities. And there has to be a way to manage that multinationality. Do we simply favor Russians and repress everyone else? Well, that, at least the Marxists thought, was the way the Soviets, the Tsarist Empire was in fact doing it. And Lenin takes a rather extreme view of recognition of the rights of national self-determination of all of the subordinate peoples. And they actually try to exercise that through formation of autonomies and village Soviets and republics, recognizing that they're at a stage of development that should encourage national cultural progress among these non-Russian peoples. Extraordinary experiment that goes on goes on to the end of the Soviet Union to some extent, but certainly is accelerated in the 1920s after Lenin's death as well, until Stalin begins to think about the problem of unity and disunity in the 1930s and enforces a much more Russo-centric policy to make sure that everyone remembers that they're Soviet, not just Armenian, Georgian, Ukrainian, and so forth. So there's a more patriotic allegiance to the Soviets that's developed after roughly 1931. But Stalin is central in Lenin's development of his views of national self-determination. It's Lenin who generates the ideas to extent. And Stalin's great ability is to be the interpreter or the propagator of those ideas. Stalin is not a original thinker in Marxist theory, as say Lenin is or Trotsky was or someone like that, but he is a good propagator of the views of the more dominant theories. And then, of course, once he becomes a powerful figure, he makes his own innovations or restrictions on the further development of that thought.
Right. So I'm going to now, this is going to be my last question before I open it up. I'm not going to 1970, but I am specifically looking at the period from 1912 to 1915, where there's a lot of change in how the revolution is supposed to work and how the sort of the cog of the revolutionary machine is functioning. At this point of time, as you have just pointed out, that Stalin was not an original thinker, but he was a good manager. And perhaps he was a good, he had a sort of a control over the system that he could get people out. But at this point of time, the trade union politics has been crushed. There's absolutely nothing else that is going on. Now, and Stalin is young, but he's getting older. How does he navigate this complex and chaotic process where there are people who are much more original in thinking and thought than him? And he doesn't really have anything to run or to operate. How does he navigate these troubled waters? Because he has the support of Lenin, but Lenin, more often than not, is not in Russia. And Stalin keeps on coming in and going out. How does he navigate these choppy waters? And what does this tell about the later Stalin, the great manager of the Soviet machine?
So this period, let's say roughly 1910 or 1912 to the World War I, 1914, that period is very interesting. And my own teacher and PhD thesis director, Leopold H. Hameson, was a specialist in that period. And a couple of things are happening. So the period after 1907, roughly till 1910, 1912, is the most dismal period for the revolutionaries. Everything has been crushed, and people are underground, and many people leave the party. But a few, like Stalin, stay in. This is his métier. This is where he's going to live, and he's dedicated to the revolution. And Lenin appreciates that very much. After roughly 1912, things start to accelerate again. Among the working class, among the labor movement, there's some very vicious repressions by the Tsarist regime. Out in Siberia, there's the killing of workers who demonstrated and went on strike at the Lena, L-E-N-A, gold fields. And the workers' movement, to some extent student movements, society's beginning to rumble again after 1912 to 1917. And my mentor, Leopold Hameson, argued that by the eve of World War I, by July, August 1917, a revolutionary situation was developing in Russia, which the coming of war that summer dampened and delayed until 3 years later in 1917. So that's the kind of architect of that period. So where's Stalin, you're asking? Well, Stalin is in a difficult position. He's in and out of prison, in and out of exile, and he finds his way to Petersburg in the years before the war. And as you mentioned, he runs in and out of Russia as an agent of Lenin. And this is an interesting period of his life because he's very close to Lenin and to Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, and they see him as a valuable agent. one of the few they can depend on. And at that period, around 1912, there's a newspaper, Pravda, Truth, which is developed in Petersburg. There is the existing of a labor movement. Some labor unions even are allowed to exist within limits. And there is a kind of parliament in the city, in Petersburg, the Duma, which was something granted by the Tsar in 1905, in October 1905. So there are also elections to this Duma. And so the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, as this radical party, are involved in elections, trade union activity, newspaper work, and Stalin is involved just before his arrest and his final exile from 1913 to 1917 in those activities, and is working within those activities. So it's a very important period, short as it is, in Stalin's own development. And he shows skills. He shows skills in terms of journalism and organization and working with different constituencies. And this is a period that will give Lenin the idea that this guy has talents that would be very useful. Stalin's career all the way through was absolutely dependent on Lenin's patronage until the very end of Lenin's life, when there's a dispute between Lenin and Stalin over the national question. But Lenin had faith in Stalin, and only very late in his life, before he became quite incapacitated, did Lenin not perceive, and only at the end did he perceive, that this man had tendencies, not a very good comrade, he would write, too brusque, and so forth, and tried to curtail Stalin's further ascent, but it was already too late.
Thank you so much for that. So this was the end of the discussion. It's been going on for almost an hour and a half now. So for everybody who has not read the book, this is 850 pages, but feels like 500, and it's or rather a breezy 450. So do get the book, read it, but more importantly, Stalin more and more is coming to cast a shadow which is longer and larger than what it would have been had he just been a ruler of a country. I think more as an idea, but also as a nightmare, as Vladimir Putin has showed us, because let's not forget, after the recent election, Foreign Policy put out a very interesting article on March 24th, where they compared Stalin and Putin. And we now realize that Stalinism of Russia is complete, and there cannot be a better book. And the Deutsche Memorial Prize, as we've just learned, is the only book award that matters. So please definitely get the book. And Professor, thanks a lot for doing it. And it has been an enlightening and an amazing session for me to host.
And thank you very much. And I'll end by saying, all power to the people. It's still a good idea. All we need is to find a new people.
On that note, thank you very much. Have a good day ahead.
Bye-bye. Thank you.